Hello and welcome. If you're joining us as an attendee, just note we have to give ourselves a little bit of time to let everybody enter the webinar, and we'll get started in just a few moments. All right, I see the flow slowing down a little bit, so I think we'll get started. My name is Kurt Kipka, and I'm the Chief Impact Officer at Apparel Impact Institute. I'm also a member of the Climate Solutions Portfolio Advisory Council. Climate Solutions, Climate Solutions Portfolio, or CSP as we refer to it, is a tool which we'll be covering today. And in particular, we're going to go into more details on this call about what AII is looking for when we consider identifying, funding, and reporting on climate impact solutions. Next slide. First, I want to present our vision for the Climate Solutions Portfolio and ultimately why we've called upon ourselves and partners in the industry in order to bring about a goal to supercharge impact, particularly around climate action for this industry. We feel that AII is uniquely positioned to connect and organize the industry and its stakeholders around urgent climate action, diverse funding, and vetted program implementation. We acknowledge the need now a little more than 5 years ago about finding quality solutions, shedding light on those implementation opportunities and efforts that need the most emphasis, momentum, and ultimately funding in order to effectively scale if this industry will have any shot at reaching its aspirations between now and 2030 and in subsequent years to curb the climate crisis. At the center of our strategy, as you can see demonstrated on this slide, is our organization, the Fashion Climate Fund, which I'll share a little more information on, and the Climate Solutions Portfolio as the mechanism for bringing these organizations together, representing a marketplace of solutions, equipment, and strategies that the industry can deploy for effectively and quantifiably reducing carbon emissions from the textile and fashion supply chain. Next slide. I mentioned the Fashion Climate Fund. We announced the fund just over 2 years ago now, and the intent of our Fashion Climate Fund is to raise $250 million in funding allocated between now and 2030, focused on specific climate reduction strategies. And when we deployed the Climate Solutions Portfolio, which we'll share more information about during today's meeting, our intent is to have a balance of projects, a balance of solutions, representing the portfolio or a mix of what we would refer to as risk associated with certain solutions, driving quantifiable and relatively attainable carbon reduction between now and 2030. That 2030 goal is a key one to keep in mind, particularly as we're considering projects that we will fund. We'll share more information about that later on in this call, but having a time-bound commitment really escalates the need for high-quality solutions at this point in time. Our vision for this Climate Solutions Portfolio being the point of deployment of funding is that AII would select solutions into the Climate Solutions Portfolio. This can be in two formats, which we'll describe later. One as a grantee, one as a registrant. A grantee receives funding, a registrant gets put in the marketplace. When needed, AII provides grants to solutions which demonstrate the most promise for scaled emissions reductions. And most importantly, AII connects grantees, registrants with financial partners for debt and equity financing, and also with suppliers and brands who would have an interest in bringing these solutions forward as well. I seem to have lost the shared slides. When ready, we can go right to slide 5. And I'll get us going here too. Diving into the Climate Solutions portfolio itself. Ultimately, why are we here during this call today? And that is to learn what AII is seeking to fund, what the Climate Solutions portfolio is, And here is ultimately the aspirations for the work that we're doing to build out this solutions portfolio. We want to identify what solutions exist to reduce emissions. And this is based on the reality that many in the industry face a struggle to locate science-backed, quantifiable programs with claims that are held up, vetted, and can ultimately drive quantifiable reductions. And with that, which solutions are credible and verifiable? Not only are there solutions that exist out there with quantifiable claims, but also we want to identify which solutions are viable in which settings as well, what is applicable and what is scalable across the industry. And with that, we also want to identify which solutions to prioritize, ultimately representing a bang for the buck mentality as we consider funding for our organization, but also emphasis for the industry. Where should we allocate resources, funding, and effort in order to ensure that for every dollar, for every person that we assign to these projects and processes, that we're getting a requisite and a high return on that investment from a carbon and emissions reduction standpoint. And so in practice, our vision is to have a registry of these solutions and a prioritization framework, a resource for deploying grants against the most promising solutions or those that would benefit the most from an influx of funding in order to reach a more scaled or replicable audience. And then also using this as a public resource for industry stakeholders, brands, manufacturers, even solutions providers to seek and find solutions that may not be on their radar, a trusted resource, if you will. And then finally, we view the climate solutions portfolio as a funding engine, a mechanism for lending where that represents a barrier for implementation across the sector, both for the solutions that are brought to the portfolio or through our application process, but also for the landing spot of these activities in the supply chain, focusing on facilities in the various tiers of the fashion and textile supply chain. So now that you recognize ultimately what the climate solutions portfolio is, what our aspiration for it may be, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Pauline, to provide more information about what specifically we're looking for when we refer to registration and grantees in conjunction with the climate solutions portfolio. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Kurt. So I'm Pauline Optebik. I'm the environmental portfolio lead for AII. So I oversee the kind of grant application process and managing the grants once we have selected them and taking them to scale. So what I'd like to share with you today is a bit about what it is we're actually looking for from a grant. So firstly, and most importantly, we are looking for grant projects that help deliver on those industry goals. So I'm not going to spend too much time here. I think it's very clear that there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And we really want to kind of focus on the solutions that are going to get us there very quickly. So with that in mind, what we're looking for is solutions, programs, technologies that have data, broad sectoral reach, who demonstrate significant reductions to greenhouse gases and who are on their way to scale by 2030. So this is kind of our overarching statement, and we're kind of unpack that today with a bit more detail, as well as how we evaluate that as well. So firstly, what are we really looking to fund from a thematic perspective? So if we think of that graph and the very steep curve to reduce emissions, we've taken the work that we do with with WRI on the net zero report that we've written, and we've assessed, where are most of those emissions reductions going to come from on that 2030 horizon, and we've used that to kind of allocate loosely where we want our funding to go. So this has then been split into different levers. On the one hand, we have the kind of bucket of what we can call energy efficiency, which looks at reducing process demand for energy, reducing energy losses, 40% going to that. The largest portion going to actually changing how we generate energy and reducing the emissions intensity of that. And then the kind of smaller portion going to more the material side of things. So minimizing waste in production, supporting circularity, and reducing emissions from production of existing fibers. So this is the, as I said, loose kind of allocation that we'll be looking for on an annual basis. And that's aligned on the one hand with our net zero roadmap report. And on the other hand, of course, what AII kind of has thematically worked on in the past, so that when we select climate solutions and we want to support them to scale after the grants, this aligns well with the work that AII already does. The other lens that we're looking at then is not just what we're going to fund, but kind of what stage is it at. So that's where this can it scale by 2030 question is really important. So again, here we've categorized, we have done a categorization, and this looks at kind of pre-seed, pilot, model, and scale. And again, we have these guardrails of broadly speaking what we're going to fund on an annual basis allocated into these different buckets. And naturally, because our goal is to kind of support solutions that will scale by 2030, less is going to the pre-seed, because if you're still in that concepting phase, it's unlikely that the amount of money that we have available for grants is going to make a big difference in there, because it's typically high investment need, but it also needs a lot more proof before it can be deployed at scale. So the piloting is really our sweet spot, where the concept is proven, some investment has already gone into that solution, but perhaps it needs to be kind of proved in the wild, so to speak, so in a facility or in a field, and to really kind of give it the in-action data to drive it forward and to prove that it can work. Then when we're looking at model, that's where a pilot or a few pilots have already taken place, but maybe there are some barriers that still need to be dealt with for the solution, and a grant project could support alleviating those barriers. And we still do want to assign funding to projects and solutions that are already mature and deploying at scale, because they still need to happen. And in some cases, they might need support because there's financing issues from who is going to pay for this deployment. And we might facilitate a project to make sure that that deployment happens. Now, with both of these slides that I've just presented, I just want to say that it's not a hard and fast rule that it will be exactly 40 to pilot, 30 to model every year, but this is loosely kind of what we're using for decision making and allocation of grants. So I also really wanted to speak today about what is really the purpose of a grant-funded project, even if it kind of meets our thematic areas and it has a kind of a specific stage of commercialization. There are certain things we're looking from the project itself. And I guess the key guiding principle is that the funding should be additional. So it's, funding that has helped something take place that was otherwise struggling to take place, and that it's going to help the sector achieve its goals and really kind of create some type of learning that's going to help the sector move forward. So that could be a project that alleviates barriers to a certain technology being deployed, something that's going to contribute to sectoral learning. So I will say that it is a requirement that the results of a project are shared with AII and the sector. We're, of course, not going to open up all of the kind of secret sauce of a technological solution, but there will be learnings from the grant project that we want to share so that the sector can take those on and help that solution to scale. And yeah, how the grant project can actually bring that solution to scale is also a very important component when thinking about designing a grant project. And what is a key importance as well is that the project should not just help the sector reduce emissions at some point in time, although we are very much looking for that as well. The project itself also needs to result in emissions reduction. So I think this is where we differentiate between something that might enable reductions later on, which we're not saying is not important. There are lots of research projects or kind of other things that enable the reduction of emissions that need to take place. But our grant funding specifically should also enable reductions as a direct result of the project. And that's something that indeed we want to track at the end of our grant funding. And then, yeah, really thinking about future deployment as well. So there is this scalability element, but yeah, really thinking of once the grant project is finished, how will this solution continue to be deployed once the grant funding has come to an end? So that's a bit about kind of what we're looking to fund and what a grant project should look like, what type of issues it should address. I'll also talk a bit about what funding is actually available. So the availability is $50,000 to $250,000 per year. So that is of course a per year funding. Projects can be multiple years, and that is quite common, we have seen in the applications we get. We do have specific kind of guardrails on what that funding can be used for. So there are some examples here, which is, potentially project management to facilitate the implementation of a solution across several facilities, for example, to do some proving work. So as I mentioned, it can be supporting the actual running of trials, because that often is a struggle to get financing for that. Any project-related expenses, of course, but I think the key thing to bear in mind with this funding is the additionality. So we really want to see in a grant funding application that the funding is being used to do something that otherwise would have struggled to take place, because that's how we then evaluate that this project is going to kind of solve a problem, answer a question, and really drive the sector forward. And to kind of build on what Kurt mentioned earlier on in the presentation, how does this then fit into that 2 billion unlock? Well, the grant project typically is not going to be kind of contributing to a big CapEx investment, also because of the funding available. But there might be a CapEx investment needed off the back of a project. So to give you an example of some of the work, one of the projects we have funded is a solar PV project. So the grant is being used to manage to conduct the feasibility assessments across 30 facilities, all of the project management associated with that, vendor selection, implementation support. The funding is not going to the actual procurement of the solar panels. That's where this wider sustainable financing strategy comes in, where a lot of our grant projects then actually become the pipeline for that sustainable financing strategy. So that's something else to consider, is that if you are looking for CapEx support, there is the opportunity to be included in that side of our work. And that's, of course, something that can be communicated in the grant funding application. But this is just to give an overview of how the grant funding can catalyze the availability of further capital as needed. So now we're going to go into a section on how the applications are actually going to be assessed. I will say that in the lead up to the application, which is opening on the 1st of March, we will have a more detailed session that goes into the weeds of the application and impact calculations and such. But today we're really talking about the kind of governance and the framework of assessment. So this is a bit of how the process works. So we have our open call, which starts on the 1st of March, and the application period lasts a month, at which point we kind of screen out any applications that are out of scope. And we define out of scope as anything that kind of doesn't meet our grant funding thesis, which is what we're presenting today in the detailed document being available on our website. At that point, the Advisory Council, which I will introduce in the next slide, kind of reviews according to their subject matter expertise and creates a short list of applications that we want to consider. The Advisory Council then meets to discuss it as a group and makes a smaller selection still of around 10 to 15 applications that we would invite to pitch to really bring their application to life, a chance for us to ask more detailed questions. And then again, there is a session of the Advisory Council coming together to select the projects they would like to put forward, which our board, the AII board, then approves. And as needed, we also draw in external experts if we think that, you know, something very specific is applied that sounds like a good idea, but we want to get a scientist who works only on that just to make sure that we are kind of going in the right direction. So our advisory council is a selection of some of which are on the call today, who we will hear from later on. Kurt has already spoken. He's the AI representative on the advisory council, but we have a mix of representatives to make sure that on the one hand, we have strong subject matter expertise where a lot of the applications will come from, as well as brand representatives and of course manufacturing representatives as well. So this is the group of people who evaluate the applications. So on the topic of evaluation, and to introduce another advisory council member, I will now hand it over to Linda, who will take us through the framework that we are using to evaluate applications.
Great. Thanks so much, Pauline. And just to introduce myself, I'm Linda Greer. I'm one of the scientific advisors to AII and to the Advisory Council. I've been doing the work that I'm about to describe closely with Phil Patterson, who is a textile expert, and I want to make sure to fully credit him for his enormous contributions to everything I'm about to describe. We are going to be evaluating applications using 3 criteria that are listed here. One is effectiveness, which is basically how much CO2 or greenhouse gas emissions does a solution reduce. The next is the reach of the solution, which is how broadly the solution is relevant to the various types of fibers, fabrics, and production within the industry. And the third is a scale, which is how big is it now, and what is a realistic projection of how big it can get by 2030 and then beyond. After we have considered these 3 criteria, we also look at the funding ask, because as a practical matter, we are interested in the biggest bang for the bucks for our money. So we are interested in how much reduction we could get per dollar, so to speak, of our investment. Next slide. To get a little bit more detail on effectiveness, as I said, how much does the solution reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, and how much will the grant project contribute to these emission reductions? Now, to really understand effectiveness, it's very important to us to be able to judge applications fairly and evenly across the different applications. And the biggest problem that we anticipated when putting together our framework was that applications would come with claims on percentage reductions, but it would be compared to what? And the percentage reductions would not be even. It would not be everybody looking at the same baseline that reductions were occurring. And so when we do our effectiveness calculations, we also provide to the applicant what baseline they need to be comparing their reductions to, so that we get percentages that all make sense across all the applications that we're receiving. And there will be more detail on the effectiveness calculations in subsequent materials that we provide to the applicants. Next slide. So reach, as I mentioned, was how much of the industry can really be impacted by the solution. And I think the easiest way to describe this is to maybe give an example between, let's say, a solution that comes to us that has an innovative way of dyeing cashmere fibers, which is a very small percentage of the total industry, versus something that can reduce the carbon emissions of some aspect of manufacture of polyester. And so you could see there that because polyester is a relatively bigger fabric and fiber, that the reach of the solution would be much bigger. Now, I'm not here to say that the only solutions that would be selected are those with absolute maximum reach, but you can see how reach would be a very important thing for us to consider, again, when trying to maximize the impact of our funding on reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the industry. And many of the solutions that come to us will have specific processes and sub-processes that they target. And we are very interested in that sort of level of impact, not just on the very biggest picture impacts that are claimed out there. And so something that comes to us that lowers the temperature of the rinsing water of pretreatment, we're all in. We have a baseline for what we think that is generally. We're interested in seeing how your solution would reduce that, and then we'll take the numbers from there. Next slide. Okay, so scale is how far and how quick can the solution grow in the marketplace. This one is a little squishier than the other two. The other two have hard numbers, which, you fill in certain pieces of the application and hard numbers flow out from that, those checked boxes, et cetera, et cetera. But here, what we are really looking at is a realistic projection of how quickly this solution can grow, and of course, how our project support would help that solution to contribute to the industry's 2030 goals. We have sort of seen it all in terms of scale projections, and I would just bound it like this. We would be relatively less interested in a technology with very small ambitions to scale. So maybe there's a new machine. This technology is saying that by 2030, they could build 4 more. That would not be that interesting to us. But I have to also say that an application that comes in that has, 4 machines and says they'll have 10,000 by 2030 doesn't seem credible either. And so what we're looking for are credible projections for how fast the technology could scale, and then an understanding of the pinch points that technology is going to face in order to scale, so that we can know how our support will help that technology to overcome those pinch points. Next slide. In terms of the funding ask, this is pretty straightforward. What is the amount of money that the proposal is asking for? And for us, what is the amount of money per tons of CO2 reduction that we're looking for? And as Pauline described in several slides earlier, what exactly is the funding being used for? Where will our money go? And then the issue of additionality, what difference will our funding make to this project? Again, the overall purpose of the whole program is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions as quickly and effectively as possible. And so our funding ask informs us for the sort of best use of our money. Next slide. I believe this is my last slide, and it's a very important slide, which is that we require standardized and verifiable numbers behind the claims of the technologies. We are accustomed to seeing claims that read a bit more like a press release, that tell us why we should be excited about a technology, but doesn't give the numbers behind it. We are requiring real numbers behind it, either measurements or estimates that are based on reasonable assumptions that give us the numbers behind the performance claims in order to process the application. And to get those standardized numbers, your application's input will be fed into something that we call the Ready Reckoner, which is an impact evaluator tool that is used to compare the impacts of these applications to each other. So this harkens back to the opening of my part of the webinar, where I was saying that we have taken a lot of time to develop baselines and bases for comparison, so that when the applications come in, we are able to quantify them against each other. Next slide.
Yes, thank you, Linda. So as I mentioned, the tool that Linda just referenced is a big part of the application, and we will be having a separate webinar to kind of go into detail on that. But we are joined by some other advisory council members as well, and we wanted to take the remainder of the webinar to hear a bit of all of the advisory council's perspective on the grant applications they've seen, what they're excited for, and of course I've seen some Q&A come in, and we will answer those as well. So maybe to kick off with Crispin and then Beth, if you could just introduce yourselves and maybe start with kind of what one of your most interesting insights was from being on the advisory council of the first year based on the applications that you saw.
Sounds good. I can kick us off. I'm Crispin Wong. I work with Lululemon and I lead our sustainable product and packaging work. And I would say from the first round of applications, it was really interesting to see the diversity of solutions that came in, as well as the range of specificity. And I think one of the areas where we landed and where this webinar was really leaning into is where applications came in with a really strong point of view about where they were in their process and how the funding could help advance them is really where it made a much more compelling application. An example would be, we've tested at these facilities, we have this level of data, but these are the conditions that we need to test next in order to understand how far we can scale and really get us to the next level. And here's why the community at the Climate Solutions Portfolio and Apparel Impact Institute would help us get there. And those were really the ones that were really interesting and that we really wanted to learn more about. I'll maybe stop there and hand it over to you, Beth, and we can keep the conversation going.
Yeah. So I'm Beth Jensen. I lead the Climate and Nature Impact platform at Textile Exchange. And for those who might not be familiar with us, we're a nonprofit organization supporting the use of preferred materials in the global fashion apparel and textile industry. And that's all toward achievement of climate and nature impact targets, which include a 45% greenhouse gas emissions reduction target by 2030 related to the raw materials and fibers used in the industry. So reflecting back on the last cycle of applicants, obviously, you've heard a common theme coming through here today that we really get the most excited about those that can demonstrate tangible GHG emissions reduction potential. But, obviously coming at this from a fibers and raw materials perspective specifically, I and Textile Exchange are really particularly interested to see projects that can be rapidly scaled within existing systems that are producing the vast majority of material volume and climate impact in the industry today. So what I mean by that is that, the majority of volume and impact related to raw materials in the industry today is related to just a handful of top, most used materials: polyester, cotton, leather, man-made cellulosics, sheep wool, and nylon, based on best available information today that we have in terms of volume and impact. I think, next gen innovations or sort of new versions of these types of materials is something we absolutely need to work on as an industry. And I'm not suggesting we stop those types of efforts. And there are also quite a lot of other organizations out there that are dedicated solely to supporting and incubating that community of sort of materials innovations. But I think we're going to need to see a lot more progress within existing systems if we're going to have any hope of achieving our targets by 2030. And then in particular, as part of that, I think I would also say that emissions reduction projects are really most interesting at this point in time for the Climate Solutions Portfolio. Emissions removals, interesting, again, something we need to continue working on and developing that field of thought, particularly related to things like regenerative agriculture and soil carbon sequestration. But I think what we're particularly interested to see is, what I would say is a bit more straightforward, the GHG emissions reductions that can be brought from different projects, whether farm level or otherwise. So just a couple of thoughts there. I have others, but maybe I'll pause there and see if we want to continue the discussion.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a really good explanation for why we have limited the grant, what we want to grant fund to the existing kind of materials system. Kurt and Linda, anything you'd like to add from your year on the advisory council, interesting insights that you came across?
After you, Linda.
Well, I would have to say that I was I'm sort of impressed with the wide range of creative solutions that are out there. Not all of them proved to be credible. A lot of them, it was sort of my pleasure to be able, through Pauline, of course, to go back to those solutions and say, well, maybe, but you'll have to develop some better numbers. And in that way, I sort of saw our role as maturing some aspects of the industry, that many of these technologies have not really been asked to date to give the numbers. and may not have developed them yet because there was no reason to develop them per se. Certainly no reason to have had a baseline that would be developed by independent experts the way that our baselines have. So one of the things that I think is interesting in the program is that we will be able to circle back to technologies that are not quite ready for prime time, and thereby mature certain promising technologies with that encouragement for them to develop the data, and then hopefully be able to fund them another time.
And just the last thing I'll add is that one thing that we saw, in addition to the results from the application process and our findings today, in my view, is really proof of concept associated with what we set out to achieve. There is a real need here to sort through what are viable solutions, where there's need for added attention, where there's a need for added investment. We still have plenty of work to do to continue uncovering where those best possible solutions exist and how we can be a catalyst for bringing them forward. But there's absolutely a right opportunity for this industry to effectively vet and allocate momentum and resources to the types of solutions that we're capturing in this process.
Absolutely. And Crispin, as a brand representative, what are you excited about this year, or something that you really would love to see that would, help you uncover some of the barriers that you're experiencing in your decarbonization strategy that, some grants could help?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, just what I will call bread and butter, obviously, is continuing to accelerate what we know is working, but reaching other parts of the population around efficiency and advancing overall facility decarbonization. I think those are always of interest, and it's a great area of need with our suppliers. And then I think the other exciting area that we are starting to get more interest in, but it's an area where it's really hard to get the concrete numbers, is around dyeing and finishing. I think it'll be interesting to keep our eye on that space, because it's also an area that is hard to scale. It's a little bit different than fibers in terms of just getting the traction and understanding how chemistry or processes or machinery can help reduce overall emissions in the processing. And then, of course, as Beth said, just continuing to look at how we're reducing the emissions and impact related to fibers in general, especially some of the most used fibers. And that's where more of the circularity discussions come in, as well as farming and looking at how we accelerate impact in that space.
Yeah, Beth, anything to build on that, on the materials and circularity side?
No, that's right. I mean, I think just a layer on top of all of this, I would say, is that I get particularly excited about really simple solutions, things that are, elegant in their simplicity, but that then can be, rapidly scaled. And not to say that, again, we're not going to consider solutions that are more sort of technically complicated, or complicated in other ways. But I think some of the projects in the past round that were really most intriguing were some of those that are sort of like, oh, this is so simple yet so effective for what we're trying to do. So just kind of another layer over everything we've been talking about here.
Great. And Linda, you alluded that water temperatures excite you a lot. Is there anything you'd like to build on that as a specific call out for applications?
Yeah, so this is sort of like a triple nerd alert of what gets me excited. But when you really look at the solutions or the sources of greenhouse gas emissions, there are very particular hotspots in manufacturing that really need to be addressed first. Because if you're going to spend time and money on a technology to reduce things, you should go to those particular hotspots. And so those areas that reduce the temperature needed for hot water are of great interest, because the carbon can go down. And those solutions that reduce the temperatures needed for drying and finishing are similarly of great interest. And interestingly, we don't have as many solutions for printing as I thought we might. And so solutions that look at printing are interesting because when you look across what we call the gas map in terms of where the greenhouse gases are coming from, printing has a very heavy footprint. And so, yeah, I think that the sub-process level of things is where the action is. And the sub-process, as Crispin mentioned, has gotten less attention. I think because, you know, most people aren't textile chemists, as a matter of fact, and it is very granular. But we've had the benefit of Phil Patterson and his cohort of other experts that he's called in to really help us to identify where those needs are, and then will help us evaluate which solutions might really fill the gap.
Great. And then before we move on to the Q&A, Kurt, what are you looking for this year?
Well, I may be getting ahead of ourselves a little bit, but a big project which we launched last year was a focus on thermal energy roadmaps and energy storage roadmaps. I'm really keen to see the outcomes of those work products and how we might begin to apply them to this application process as well. Those are notable opportunities, especially the thermal energy transition plan for this industry that we want to participate in. We found ourselves unable to participate in it as a result of the application process last year, just because we didn't have the plot line to follow. With these roadmaps, we feel very strongly that we'll have not only a direction of travel for the grant funding and emphasis we want to place on projects going forward, but also provide some guidance for the industry around the thermal energy next steps and roadmap to addressing what is one of the biggest needs for this sector and the supply chain as a whole.
Yeah, thank you for that call out. I think useful to note as well is that we have this open call for applications that starts on March 1st. And then in the kind of later half of this year, when those work products that Kurt mentioned are finished, we'll be making a very specific and targeted call for projects that address energy storage and thermal energy. So indeed, that will be very exciting because that's will be a new space for us as a grant maker. So we have some questions that have come in from the audience. Maybe Kurt, give this one for you. What is the definition of the, well, AII's manufacturers? Is this garments only? Is it leather and shoes as well? Textiles? How do we define manufacturers as an organization?
Yeah, so we purposely say fashion, and fashion meaning that we are willing and open to funding solutions outside of the typical apparel, textile supply chain. However, the reports which we follow and the tools which we've created are highly textile and apparel focused based on the data that's made available in those categories of work. And so the only thing I'll say for someone who's looking at a non-apparel, non-textile oriented solution is that you're going to need to show your work. And we will need to see the data and math to support calculations that are being made and claims in order to effectively provide grant funding and registration of those solutions as we build out our approach, our criteria for being able to fund solutions across the fashion product base. However, from a manufacturer standpoint, we're looking at, I like to say, sites. We're looking at different touch points throughout the apparel sector, ranging from what is broadly defined as tier 1 all the way back to tier 4. So cut and sew, garment manufacturers, all the way back to farm level of production.
Thank you. So I think I'll take this question actually, which goes to the other end of the emissions, which is end of life. So do the effectiveness calculations include end of life emissions, for example, methane from textile waste in landfills? So the tool that we have made is not perfect, and one of the limitations it has is this end of life question. And we know that that's generally a struggle that anyone looking at the topic of circularity has, because it's less standardized than emissions reporting in other areas. So the tool is admittedly kind of more suiting the purpose of the linear economy, because that's the data that we have now, and then also solutions that are operating in that. So we very much welcome through the application process that organizations looking at reducing end-of-life emissions through circularity submit their own calculations, and we will review those. This is, a very complicated part of the industry, as I'm sure the person asking this question knows. And we're kind of, thinking of how we can improve the tool's ability to deal with that. So unfortunately, that's not included for this year, but it is something that we're working on and hoping to include going forward.
Pauline, could I add just a quick commentary there as well? Is that I think including that context in the application is really important because, to use Linda's word as a triple nerd alert, we will have really detailed discussions as we look at some of these. If I'm making this up, if there is a dye technology that somehow is really easy to remove in a circularity process, even if it's unproven on how exactly we measure that impact, we would take it into consideration in looking at applicability scale and how it's enabling the overall system. So I think it's important to include that nuance, even if our tools are somewhat limited at times.
Yeah, and similar to that, the assumption that circularity displaces the need to produce virgin materials, we know that you cannot prove this based on trials. So we take that assumption on board, and we assume that displacement has occurred, is something else to note for those types of applications. So another question, which is more on the kind of maturity of a solution. So maybe Linda, you can take this one. Is the funding opportunity also to support already commercialized solutions that reduce emissions?
Yes, I think the criteria that we would be looking at again is what would be the impact of our funding in really helping the technology to grow further. So definitely such solutions would be eligible, absolutely. And we would be excited to help very promising technologies grow further. So the quick answer to that is yes. And it would be sort of considered as a plus, I think, if as a result of our funding, we could see a very effective technology with broad reach its scale faster.
Great, thank you. Kurt, maybe I'll hand this one to you. How does AII provide evaluation criteria of footprints? Is there any technical consultancy or an evaluation that we do of the reports that are submitted by applicants?
I can't believe you're handing this over to me. I feel like you should be answering this. That's what we have Pauline here for, provide the initial triage of reports as they're submitted, but also through the application process, there's really structured guidance for conducting those calculations if they're not already carried out by the solution provider itself. And we have, I'll volunteer Pauline to a certain extent on this front. If there are questions around that calculation methodology, completing the application, we are a resource for applicants as well. That's the last thing that we would want, is for the application process, the ability to effectively relay information around calculations and footprinting associated with solutions to be what inhibits good projects coming forward. And so there are resources available that we can readily provide. And then also for organizations who haven't taken that step of calculating, measuring, providing requisite data for the types of solutions we might provide registration or grant funding to. We can also provide guidance to organizations or even resources that exist out there for making that possible for some of the most promising solutions. Anything you would add to that, Pauline?
No, just that, we have on the one hand this kind of standardized calculation process that will be in the Ready Reckoner tool, a webinar for which will be kind of released in the lead up to the application. And of course, we welcome any existing LCA studies that have taken place, and those will be evaluated by the kind of subject matter experts within the advisory council. But, as I kind of showed in the flow chart of the evaluation process, if we felt that we didn't have the required expertise to evaluate that on the advisory council, we have a wealth of a network that we can ask very, very specific and detailed questions to. So we have our bases covered. Interesting question. Maybe for Beth, are you only investing in technology that is physically involved in production? For example, if we had a conversational interface working to track and motivate farmers at a farm level, would that be considered or not because it's influencing change rather than directly being used within farm practices?
Yeah, I mean, this is something we talked about quite a bit in the first round as well, just in terms of how direct is the solution to the actual greenhouse gas impact reduction, or is it more of a something that's influencing? So, I mean, I guess my answer to this would be we're considering everything, but I think the more directly that the solution is contributing to the GHG impact reduction, that's being calculated as part of the application, I think the closer it is, the more compelling the solution would be for funding. But Pauline or Kurt, that's maybe if you want to add anything there as well, just from kind of a general approach here.
I can tell all of us want to jump in on this a little bit. Just real quickly, I'll say that one benefit of having experience and expertise involved in the advisory council is a recognition that the work we do is both a science and an art. There's both a technical component of the work, but also a psychological component of the work that we know needs to be done. And we're open and recognize that the type of interface that's suggested, it actually piques my interest as a new, unique, innovative approach to overcoming some of the psychological motivational barriers that we know exist for implementing some of these solutions. And so there's a recognition on our part that in the grand scheme of things, $250,000 grant isn't going to allow a massive boiler replacement on site at a facility, but influencing change in order to facilitate a boiler replacement, that's something we're really keen to participate in. And so this novel approach is interesting, the type of innovative, novel approach that we'd be willing to entertain. Crispin, Linda, feel free.
Well, yeah,
Well, I was
just to
just
add into that. Oh, go ahead, Crispin, you go first.
no, I was just gonna say as like from the lens of a funder of the Fashion Climate Fund and the Climate Solutions portfolio, I think where I really think about and I think as a council we scrutinize is the real linear connection to carbon reduction. So we really need to have that causality link there of we love innovative ideas and we understand behavior is a very important part of that, but we need to be able to defend all the dollars really funneling into things that will get us to our ultimate decarbonization goals as an industry. So I think that's the lens that I would recommend everybody look at when they're thinking about their application. Sorry, Linda, go ahead.
No, that's okay, because actually I could build on that a little bit that, we know from our own work and then from previous applications that there are certain technologies which are not coming to scale in large part because they're very complicated. And because there's a concern that the staff on the factory floor won't be able to use the technology to its best advantage because they don't know how to use it or how to use the numbers. And so an example of where something that's not technology, but is a solution we would be interested in is something that very tangibly puts together, here's a type of technology or a type of problem on the factory floor where there are technical solutions, but they are not being readily implemented because factories rightfully feel that they can't make use of it. They won't take perfect advantage. So as Crispin was just saying, an application that makes a very tangible connection between that non-technology solution into, let's call it a pipeline of the solutions that lead to real reductions, I think that would be a very interesting application to us. But something that's just a little bit pie in the sky, more general, like we think people should be talking to each other with more depth and feeling, that's not going to do it. We would have, that would be unlikely to be successful, but the tie-in to something very specific, I think, could make that kind of application a winner.
In a very simplistic fashion, this applies to the programs that AI deploys on a regular basis. We expect to see a baseline of performance, an intervention or an action, and then a result. And so if there's some causal relationship between those activities that can be demonstrated as a beginning and endpoint, that's the quantitative approach that we would want to see from a solution such as this.
Thank you. Final question to Kurt before I share the kind of dates and next steps. How many projects will we award? What is available?
Yeah, I get this question a lot, and I kind of say the same response each time. We would love to have the problem of having too many good projects to fund, because that represents an opportunity for us to seek additional funding and bring more ultimately funders to the Fashion Climate Fund and to support this work. As of right now, we have funding available, and as of right now, I don't see a need to limit the number of projects that we would consider for grant funding. So if you consider we funded 5 as of last year, I think 5 to 10 this year is a reasonable number. However, as I mentioned, we're open to having a queue if we need to of projects that are readily available for funding that we would bring forward and bring to some of our stakeholders and grant funders that AII facilitates in order to demonstrate that there's more to be had out there. So I'm not going to put a limit on it, but I would say around the 5 to 10 grantee mark is what we would be looking for this year.
Thank you. And then just on some next steps. So the application will open on the 1st of March and run to the end of that month. The 29th is a Friday. If you have any questions, you can always have a look at the Climate Solutions portfolio where we have all of the grants listed. You can download our grant funding thesis, which is basically all of the detail to what we've spoken to today, our FAQs. If you still feel like you have questions on whether you're suitable for an application, you can email us, and the application guidance, so the detailed document that kind of explains what the application requires, as well as an accompanying recording of how to use the calculation tool, will be made available around a week before the application opens. So thank you all for joining us today. We hope it was informative, and we look forward to receiving some good applications. Have a good day, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.